Hey guys, learn an interesting story in 30 minutes. Today I'm going to talk about the most powerful president of the United States and the founder of world hegemony, President Roosevelt. 555 from Gilded Age darling to savior of the Great Depression, Franklin D. Roosevelt's path to power and a fateful turn. In the summer of 1887, President Grover Cleveland looked warily at a 5-year-old boy. The boy's name was Franklin D. Roosevelt. Cleveland, burdened by endless political strife and gridlock, said to the innocent child, "I hope you never become President of the United States." Cleveland could not have foreseen that this carefree boy would one day become one of America's greatest presidents. Roosevelt's legendary life began with this contradictory start. It was a story of personal twists and turns, mirroring a nation's journey from the false prosperity of the Gilded Age into the abyss of the Great Depression, and finally to a phoenix-like rebirth. A king, in a gilded cagey childhood in an ivory tower, and the reality of the world, Franklin D. Roosevelt's childhood was perfect. He was born into an astonishingly wealthy and prominent family. His father was a railroad company president, and his mother a high society socialite. Their home was less a house and more a kingdom, a magnificent, hundreds-acres estate with farms, forests, and vineyards, and a full staff of servants for their family of 3. As the only child, Roosevelt was surrounded by his parents' affection and quickly turned the estate into his personal playground. He rode his pony, hunted in the family forests with his special hounds, and skated on the frozen river. His world was a carefully crafted ivory tower. He socialized with peers from elite families and traveled to old European noble estates and luxurious hotels. During the Gilded Age, American capitalism boomed, and capitalists were widely revered. The Roosevelts were a prime example of this era. However, beneath this glittering facade, a harsh reality was brewing. In 1889, as the Wall Street Journal launched, the Second International was being founded in Paris, and workers' movements were spreading globally. The aristocrats, who appeared in the Illustrated London News, hunting and attending balls, were oblivious to the hatred and struggles about to erupt. Likewise, Roosevelt could not have imagined that Mussolini, born the same year as him, was sleeping on a sack filled with corn husks, struggling on the brink of poverty, while Stalin, in the muddy streets, listened to his parents' arguments and sowed the seeds of revolution in his heart. Roosevelt's childhood was that of a hothouse flower, a reflection of his class's narrow view of the world. He couldn't fathom that beyond the glamorous private yachts and luxury trains, hundreds of thousands of immigrants were crammed into squalid tenements, staring with bewildered eyes at a new country. This immense contrast laid the groundwork for the major turning point in his life. To fight here from shattered dreams to rebirth the hammer of fate, of polio. Roosevelt's youth was smooth sailing. He had private tutors, learned multiple languages, and, with his parents' support, could pursue any hobby. He loved sailing, so his father bought him a sloop. He was a stamp collector, so his mother and uncle gifted him their collections, which eventually grew to over 1 million stamps. These hobbies not only enriched his life, but also cultivated his sense of adventure and a broad view of the world. He once dreamed of becoming a naval officer, but fate would steer him to a much larger role, commander-in-chief during the Pacific War. At 14, he entered the elite Groton School and later went to Harvard University. Publishing articles in the school newspaper and starring in plays, everything came so easily to him. His optimism, humor, and strong charisma made him the center of attention, traits that would later become his key to winning over voters. However, on his smooth path, one person planted another seed. For his distant cousin and future wife was Eleanor Roosevelt. Unlike Franklin's privileged upbringing, Eleanor's life was filled with tragedy. Her mother and brother died of diphtheria, and her father passed away from alcoholism. She grew up lonely and in pain, which gave her deep empathy for the less fortunate. She was passionate about charity, teaching dance to the children of the poor. It was through Eleanor's classes that Roosevelt first got a glimpse into how the poor lived. He was deeply shocked by a dilapidated tenement, a world he had never imagined. "I didn't even know people lived in conditions like that," Roosevelt later recalled. Eleanor was like a window, showing him a completely different world. This empathy for the disadvantaged became the most important foundation of his political career. The real turning point came in 1921. At 39, Roosevelt was a rising political star, having served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and run for Vice President. His future looked bright until a vacation in Fundy. A sudden sharp back pain and a chill led to the loss of feeling in his legs. Within days, the paralysis spread to his lower body, and at one point, even to his upper body. The diagnosis was devastating: polio. The man who had been a dynamic political figure was, overnight, a cripple who couldn't walk. He was devastated. He asked his aides, "Why has God forsaken me?" Family and friends believed his political career was over. His mother even wanted him to retire from politics and live a comfortable life. But Eleanor didn't give up. She knew that politics was her husband's spiritual anchor. She stayed by his side day and night, massaging his legs and taking care of him. This trial by fire gave Roosevelt hope and refined his character. Fin Fei Fi, a polished persona and a transformed soul, the hidden strength of disability. Paralysis changed Roosevelt's life completely. From the pinnacle of society, he was forced into the ranks of the disabled. He began to understand the vulnerable in society through first-hand experience. He used his wealth to establish a rehabilitation center for people with the same disease. He designed a special car and drove through rural America, talking to farmers and workers. He saw a different side of America: rural electricity shortages, backward schools, and impoverished farmers. This personal experience gave him a clearer and more complete understanding of America than any other politician. While others were immersed in the false prosperity of the Roaring Twenties, Roosevelt shrewdly foresaw the coming crisis. He realized that a nation's long-term prosperity could not rely solely on the wealth of a few, but must benefit all of society. However, in America at the time, people with disabilities faced widespread discrimination. Many superstitiously believed that disability was a punishment from God for bad deeds. No one would vote for a paralyzed man. To return to politics, Roosevelt had to maintain a facade. He sealed off all news, claiming to the public he had only a cold. Later, he let the New York Times announce he had polio but would soon recover. From then on, a public Roosevelt was born. Leaning on one cane and his son's arm, he would slowly and painfully walk to the podium. He smiled, calm and composed, and no one could sense the immense pain in every step. If someone were to lift his trouser leg, they would see his severely atrophied legs supported by a steel brace. This facade was not just to save his political career, it was an act of self-transcendence. Roosevelt practiced day after day just to be able to stand for a few minutes and walk to the podium alone. His son later recalled, "Those were lonely years. We didn't have a real father, a father we could touch and talk to. But it was this loneliness and perseverance that forged his iron will." In 1928, when he reappeared at the Democratic Convention, 15,000 delegates watched him in hushed anticipation. He walked slowly but steadily to the microphone, without falling or faltering. When he successfully reached the podium, a thunderous applause filled the hall. At that moment, he proved himself through action and won over everyone. Two Fun Pafie Clash of Titans, the showdown between Roosevelt and Hoover. On October 24, 1929, an unprecedented financial crisis erupted. Black Thursday was followed by Black Monday and Black Tuesday. The stock market crashed and fortunes evaporated overnight. Former millionaires became street vendors, and millions lost their jobs and homes, becoming homeless wanderers. The president at the time, Herbert Hoover, was a staunch believer in the free market. He trusted in this invisible hand and refused government intervention, believing that if the market was left alone, everything would return to normal. He even wrote that street vendors selling fruit were a natural occupation arising from the market economy. Hoover's inaction led to a complete economic shutdown. By 1932, the unemployment rate had reached 23.6%. People lost faith in capitalism, some turning to communism, others to fascism. But some people turned their attention to New York. The governor, Franklin D. Roosevelt, was boldly trying new solutions. He used government power to intervene in the economy on a large scale and provide relief to the unemployed. As Roosevelt's success in New York grew, Hoover was still making his final case for re-election, but the public had lost patience. One observer commented, "Even if you put a rose in Hoover's hands, it would wither." The election result was a landslide victory. Roosevelt won 42 of the 48 states. As a member of a vulnerable group, he represented the hopes of the people. On March 4, 1933, over 400,000 people gathered in front of Capitol, silent. America was in its greatest crisis since the Civil War. National industrial output had fallen by half, and a quarter of the workforce was unemployed. The outgoing president, Hoover's last words were, "We are at the end of our rope, we are helpless." This was the America Roosevelt inherited, a paralyzed nation. But the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. How a man who couldn't walk led a paralyzed nation, facing a nation in crisis. Roosevelt delivered a historic inaugural address. He acknowledged the grim reality, but declared with conviction, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself." These words, like a sharp sword, pierced the despair that shrouded people's hearts. He declared war on the Great Depression, promising a New Deal. He proposed large-scale government intervention, using public works to combat unemployment, stabilizing the monetary system, and curbing speculation. With a clear plan and firm resolve, he pointed the way forward. A man who couldn't walk was about to lead a paralyzed nation. This was more than a politician's promise. It was a disabled person's defiant cry against fate. Roosevelt used his own body and will to show the world that even if you fall, you can get back up. Even in the dark, you can find hope. As a disabled person, he led a nation on the brink of collapse toward revival, ultimately shaping it into a global superpower. And Cleveland's well-intentioned advice became history's greatest irony, because it was by becoming president that Roosevelt truly realized his life's purpose and helped America find its soul. 2 Roosevelt's 100 Days, a race against time, a U-turn on tradition. On March 4, 1933, when Franklin D. Roosevelt was sworn in, he inherited a paralyzed nation. The Great Depression had been raging for 3 years, with over 5,000 banks collapsing, 86,000 businesses shutting down, and GDP plummeting by half. 100,000 people were losing their jobs every week. The air was thick with despair, and people began to believe the nightmare would never end. A friend told him, "If you succeed, you will be the greatest president in American history." Roosevelt replied, "If I fail, I will be the last president." He knew that to solve this unprecedented crisis, he had to find its root cause. Let's rewind the clock 20 years to the end of World War I. The war, while bringing immense disaster, also spurred significant technological advancements. Post-war, these technologies were adapted for civilian use, leading to the boom of new industries like automobiles, petroleum, and electricity. America, untouched by the war on its mainland, and with a plentiful supply of demobilized soldiers, held a unique advantage in the global market. A seemingly impregnable era of prosperity was born. However, a cancer of wealth inequality was quietly growing beneath this prosperous surface. From 1919 to 1927, factory productivity soared by a stunning 53%, but workers' wages barely budged. The vast majority of wealth was siphoned by capitalists, causing a massive mismatch between social purchasing power and the huge volume of goods. To mask this structural problem, the government and banks worked together, easing lending and encouraging installment plans to stimulate consumer spending. In a climate of blind optimism, the stock market became a playground for a public obsessed with getting rich quick. From truck drivers to housewives, everyone believed buying stocks is easy money. Soaring stock prices were no longer based on a company's actual value, but on wild speculation. Many manipulative practices that would be illegal today were rampant then. Company shareholders could freely buy and sell their own stocks, and brokers pitched every stock as a can't-miss investment. The entire economic system became a shaky house of cards. When Black Thursday hit, the bubble burst. Panic spread rapidly, magnified by high leverage stock trading, and swept the entire market. Millions were ruined overnight, many saddled with astronomical debt. But this was just the first domino. Those who hadn't invested thought their savings were safe, but when they rushed to the banks, they were horrified to find their money had been lent to speculators. Banks, unable to collect on these loans, collapsed in a wave of runs that swept the nation, leaving no bank untouched. With no capital and no savings, people had to tighten their belts, further reducing purchasing power, and the problem of overproduction erupted. Goods from every industry sat unsold, and companies laid off workers to avoid bankruptcy. The surge in unemployment further reduced purchasing power, creating a vicious cycle. This was the crisis Roosevelt. His 100 Days was a plan to break this cycle. 2 fireside chats, and the Blue Eagle restoring trust, rebuilding order. The day after his inauguration, Roosevelt declared a nationwide bank holiday, freezing the collapsing financial system. In just a few days, he pushed through the US Emergency Banking Act, which inspected, reorganized, and closed banks. But this wasn't enough. He had to restore public trust in the banks and the government. On the eve of the bank's reopening on March 12, 1933, every American with a radio heard an unprecedented voice. "My friends, I want to take a few minutes of your time tonight to talk with you about banking." Roosevelt's calm and familiar voice explained the banking system, why it collapsed, and the government's plan. It wasn't an official speech, it was a fireside chat. A friend talking to you patiently and sincerely by the fire. He used simple language, devoid of complex economic jargon, so that almost everyone understood the problem. More importantly, he asked for the public's help. "It is your problem no less than it is mine. Together we cannot fail." The next day, a miracle happened. Long lines formed outside banks again, but people were coming to deposit money, not withdraw it. Many people redeposited the money they had frantically pulled out a week earlier. Within 2 weeks, deposits in banks nationwide increased by 50%, and the stock market rebounded strongly. One of Roosevelt's advisors commented, "Capitalism was saved in 8 days," but soon, people realized that Roosevelt's New Deal was not just about saving the system, it was about reinventing it. He transformed the government from a believer in the invisible hand to a practitioner of the invisible hand. He created the Civilian Conservation Corps, employing 3 million men to plant trees and work on conservation projects. He passed the Federal Emergency Relief Act to provide government aid to the unemployed. He launched the Gas Agricultural Adjustment Act to stabilize farm prices by controlling production. These were actions once considered private charity, but now they were the government's responsibility. The passage of the National Industrial Recovery Act on June 16, 1933, brought the reforms to a climax. Roosevelt took on the capitalists, legislating a maximum work week and minimum wage, and giving workers the right to collective bargaining. Businesses that complied received a Blue Eagle emblem. This emblem quickly became a nationwide symbol. The mayor of Boston even led a pledge, "I will only shop at Blue Eagle stores." Of course, the New Deal provoked strong opposition from capitalists. They formed the American Liberty League, accusing Roosevelt of being an unconstitutional dictator, pushing for socialism. They proclaimed that the failure of American business leaders is a myth. It is the failure of the world. Roosevelt scoffed at these criticisms, responding, "There are some timid people who seem to be in favor of standing still, and who have for our work all kinds of strange names. I am for practical explanations and practical policies." Under his leadership, the reforms continued to deepen. The Securities Exchange Act was passed, giving the government the power to regulate the stock market and crack down on insider trading. The National Housing Act lowered mortgage interest rates and extended repayment terms, rapidly increasing home ownership. In 1935, Roosevelt launched a massive, great infrastructure era, creating the U.S. Works Progress Administration, which employed 8.5 million people to build roads, bridges, and tunnels. That same year, the Social Security Act was passed, providing old age and unemployment insurance. By the end of 1935, Roosevelt's New Deal had transformed America. Unemployment had dropped from 22.9% to 14.2%, and GDP had grown at a high rate for 2 consecutive years. Roosevelt won the fervent support of the public. In the 1936 presidential election, he won a landslide victory. A journalist at the time marveled, "I have never seen any president possess such supreme authority as Roosevelt." Roosevelt even dared to challenge the principle of the separation of powers. When the conservative majority Supreme Court repeatedly struck down his New Deal legislation, he proposed adding new justices to fundamentally change the voting outcome. This bold idea shocked everyone, and opposition was fierce, but Roosevelt's public support remained strong. In the end, the Supreme Court backed down, shifting its stance and passing several New Deal bills. Fun for Fee, the mystery of the third term, and the end of isolationism. As Roosevelt's second term was nearing its end, he was expected to retire honorably. No president had ever served more than 2 terms, an unwritten rule since Washington. Roosevelt seemed to accept this, building a library and preparing to write his memoirs. When a reporter asked his mother about it, she said, He has always planned to return to Hyde Park after this term. However, Roosevelt's ambitions went far beyond that. He knew better than anyone that World War II was not just a regional conflict, but the culmination of decades of international tensions. It would completely reshape the global order, and he would not allow America's isolationism to let it miss this historical opportunity. The challenge was immense. During World War I 110,000 American expeditionary forces died overseas, and Americans widely believed it was not worth it. They passed 3 neutrality acts, which forbade the US from selling weapons to any warring nation. Roosevelt had to chip away at these restrictions one by one. He used the Nazis' atrocities against Jews to condemn Germany, which worsened the German image in the eyes of Americans. He invited the British King and Queen to visit, using the royal charm to win over Americans' affection for Britain. When World War II began, he said in a speech, "This nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask every American to remain neutral in thought." He cleverly used a loophole to persuade Congress to pass an act, allowing the sale of weapons to warring nations on a cash and carry basis. With Britain's control over the Atlantic, this was essentially unilateral support for the Allies. Roosevelt's other goal was to rebuild a powerful military. At the time, the US military ranked 16th in the world, behind even Poland and Romania. He boldly promoted George Marshall, giving him full authority to replace outdated generals and promote new ones like Eisenhower and Patton. He gave impassioned speeches to Congress, arguing that in the age of air power, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were no longer natural barriers. He successfully persuaded Congress to increase military spending, injecting billions of dollars into the defense industry and awakening the world's #1 industrial power. On July 16, 1940, the Democratic National Convention was held in Chicago to nominate the presidential candidate. Roosevelt didn't even attend, only having a message read that the president has no intention of seeking re-election. As soon as the announcer finished, a voice from the crowd shouted, "We want Roosevelt!" This cry was a signal that ignited the whole convention. People spontaneously chanted slogans, held up Roosevelt's pictures, and began a parade. The atmosphere was so electric that no one could question its spontaneity. An hour later, the vote began, and Roosevelt's name was on the list. He won the nomination again in a landslide. When the news was brought to Roosevelt, they found that the man who had no intention of seeking re-election had already picked his running mate. On July 19, 1940, Roosevelt formally accepted the nomination. He said he could not refuse the people's choice. He would serve a 3rd term, leading America into a new era, an era that would no longer be isolated, but would set its sights on becoming a world superpower. Fun fee from king without a crown to master of the world. Roosevelt's final crowning in 1936, in front of the colossal rock sculptures of Mount Rushmore, Franklin D. Roosevelt gazed at the face of Thomas Jefferson. As the sitting president, his thoughts spanned a century of time. He hoped that even in 10,000 years, if the faces were weathered and unrecognizable, people would believe his generation had done all in their power to make it a habitable land. This was not just a tribute to his predecessors, but Roosevelt's silent acknowledgement of his own historical responsibility. At this point, America was globally recognized as the Das, king without a crown. Its steel, oil production, and GDP were all first in the world. But Roosevelt knew that to complete its ultimate coronation, America had to take the final step, to use the impending global conflict to place a crown upon its head. To feed the continuation of the fireside chats, a special friendship across the Atlantic. In September 1939, when WWI broke out, Winston Churchill, then in London, received an unexpected letter from Roosevelt. The letter was not formal, but friendly and respectful. "I am glad to see you are back as First Lord of the Admiralty. Please keep in touch with me." This letter began a special friendship across the Atlantic. Roosevelt and Churchill, 2 leaders with different personalities but similar vision and ambition, built a deep trust through over 900 letters. When the German military machine rolled across Europe and Britain was in a dire situation, Churchill placed his hope in America. He sent Roosevelt an astonishing list of military supplies, appealing to the New World to give everything it had to save the Old World. However, everyone around Roosevelt opposed the plan. Army Chief of Staff Marshall believed Britain could fall at any moment, and aid would just fall into German hands. Roosevelt's military advisors, congressmen, and Secretary of War all objected. General Walter even declared that everyone involved in this arms deal should be hung from a lamppost. But Roosevelt overruled them. He understood that Britain was America's only foothold in Europe. If Britain fell, America would lose its influence there and be confined to the Americas in an increasingly shrinking world. He believed that with American arms, Britain could hold on until the Allies could counterattack. To bypass Congress, he used every ounce of his presidential authority. He pressured Marshall to admit that the hundreds of thousands of rifles, tens of thousands of machine guns, and millions of rounds of ammunition, as well as the valuable bombers headed to Britain, were all just surplus. Marshall later recalled bitterly, "It was the first time in my life I had been so dishonest." When the Secretary of War refused to sign, Roosevelt, as Commander-in-Chief, issued a direct order. Just like that, the unarmed British Army received American weapons. Roosevelt's unilateral action was not just aid to Britain. It was a break from American isolationism. He was signaling to the world that America would no longer stand idly by. From the fee, the destroyer deal, and the Lend-Lease Act pushing America to the brink of war, aiding Britain was just the first step in Roosevelt's strategy. When Britain desperately needed destroyers to defend against German attacks, Churchill turned to Roosevelt. Roosevelt demanded a steep price, 50 old destroyers in exchange for 8 overseas military bases on a 99-year lease. This was a huge victory for America, but it was also met with strong opposition at home. Isolationists warned that this was an act of war. Faced with congressional obstruction, Roosevelt took another dangerous step. He bypassed Congress and, as President and Commander-in-Chief, directly made the deal. When a reporter asked if he had Senate approval, Roosevelt replied, "We have already made the deal. It is over." Media reactions were divided. The St. Louis News Post fumed that Roosevelt had become the first dictator in American history. But once the public understood the immense strategic value of the deal, public opinion quickly turned. The Washington Post hailed it as the first significant expansion of the American homeland since the Spanish-American War. The destroyer deal was not only a military and economic success, but also a masterful political move. With those 50 old destroyers, Churchill firmly pulled America onto his side. From that moment on, the destinies of America and Britain were like the Mississippi River, rolling forward unstoppable. When Britain's finances were nearing exhaustion and it could no longer afford to buy weapons, Roosevelt introduced an audacious plan, the Lend-Lease Act. He used a famous analogy to persuade the American public. Suppose my neighbor's house catches on fire and I have a garden hose. I can't say, "The hose costs 15. You have to pay me first." He framed the transaction as a simple act of mutual aid, but everyone knew that most of the aid would be non-repayable. America was becoming the arsenal of democracy. Hitler saw through this. He considered the Lend-Lease Act a declaration of war, but for strategic reasons, strictly warned his navy not to attack American ships. Hitler didn't want anything to interfere with his upcoming big plan, a massive assault to conquer the Soviet Union. He didn't know that Roosevelt had already predicted this move. 2-5 using one's enemy against another, an unprecedented strategic gambit. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched a lightning attack on the Soviet Union. The two most powerful nations on the Eurasian continent began to tear each other apart. For Roosevelt, this was a gift from heaven. He now had the ultimate advantage. Roosevelt quickly announced that America would do everything in its power to aid the Soviet Union. This again sparked opposition. The US War Department and British military intelligence were pessimistic, believing Hitler would conquer the Soviet Union in 1 to 3 months. Coupled with a deep-seated hostility toward communism, many felt that aiding the Soviet Union was a meaningless, dog-eat, dog-fight. But Roosevelt was unconcerned. He knew the Soviet Union was the only country on the Eurasian continent that could stand up to Germany. If the Soviets could hold them off, America could use money to buy Soviet blood, weakening Germany at minimal cost. It was a very good deal. He sent his shadow president, Harry Hopkins, to Moscow to personally assess the Soviet Union. Hopkins met with Stalin in the Kremlin and was impressed by the Soviet leader's candor and determination. Stalin told Hopkins, "Give us anti-aircraft guns and aluminum, and we can fight on for 3 or 4 years." This meeting solidified Roosevelt's resolve to aid the Soviet Union. He officially included the Soviets in the Lend-Lease Act. However, in the beginning, the aid was very limited. Roosevelt wasn't being stingy, he was simply unable to do more. He knew America needed an opportunity, a fuse that could finally ignite a full-scale war. How to maneuver them into firing the first shot. The fate and tragedy of Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt knew that a war with Japan was inevitable. After the US imposed an oil embargo on Japan, conflict was unavoidable. 12 days before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt asked his Secretary of War how to maneuver them into firing the first shot without allowing too much of a risk to ourselves. He knew negotiations would fail, and he knew war was coming. He had calculated every move, just waiting for the Japanese to strike first. He demanded that Japan withdraw all troops from China and give up all overseas territories. These harsh conditions were undoubtedly the final spark to provoke Japan. However, Roosevelt miscalculated one thing. He didn't expect the Japanese target to be Pearl Harbor. The vast majority of intelligence pointed towards Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. Only a few scattered reports mentioned Pearl Harbor, but they were ignored by High Command. When news of the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor arrived on December 7, 1941, Roosevelt's first reaction was, "My God, how could this be? I'm now pinned to the pillar of historical shame." He was devastated because Pearl Harbor was the lifeline of the US Pacific Fleet. 8 battleships, 4 of which were sunk and 3 heavily damaged. The US Navy's proud big gun and big ship doctrine was shattered overnight. Congressmen angrily questioned Roosevelt, asking why American warships were like sitting ducks. But Roosevelt quickly regained his composure. He put his hands on his head, not out of fear, but because in that moment, he took on all the responsibility. He called Churchill and said, "We are in the same boat now." He then drafted his famous speech, yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. His speech, like a sharp sword, pierced the veil of isolationism that had shrouded the American people. Roosevelt's most fervent opponents now stood with him. Former President Hoover declared, "We have to fight with all we've got." Senator Vandenberg, a longtime opponent of intervention, called the White House to pledge his on-reserve support for the president. Roosevelt left the opportunity to declare war to Hitler, and Hitler didn't hesitate to accept the gift. He saw Japan's entry into the war as a turning point in history, believing it meant someone will lose a continent. On December 11, 1941, Hitler formally declared war on the United States. This was exactly what Roosevelt wanted. He could now unleash America's full might. He appointed Chester Nimitz as commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet. Despite the numerical disadvantage, Nimitz, with courage and wisdom, won the Battle of Midway, a key turning point in the war. Roosevelt also increased aid to China, opening the dangerous Hump air transport route to deliver supplies and tie down Japanese forces. Upon the president's death and the dawn of the nuclear age, how a man who couldn't walk led a nation's leap. Another of Roosevelt's key decisions was to adopt Marshall's Europe First strategy. Even though Japan had attacked the US directly, Roosevelt insisted on prioritizing resources and attention on the European theater. He knew Germany was the biggest threat. He reached an agreement with Churchill and Stalin, and the three leaders wove a strategic net to encircle Hitler. At the same time, Roosevelt unleashed the immense potential of American industry. He unchained the capitalists, allowing them to earn excessive profits from military production. He had only one demand: produce the most and best weapons as quickly as possible. Under Roosevelt's leadership, American productivity exploded. Warships were launched like dumplings into boiling water, and a new aircraft rolled off the assembly line every few minutes. Hitler later admitted to the Japanese ambassador that the US was an opponent he simply did not know how to defeat. Throughout the long war, Roosevelt was with the people. He sent all 4 of his sons to serve in the military, demonstrating with his actions that he was on the same side as the people. In his fireside chats, he asked people to get out maps and analyze the war together, making every American feel a part of the effort. As the war neared its end and people's faces showed signs of relief and joy, no one noticed that their president was falling behind. In February 1945, at the Yalta Conference, Churchill's doctor, Lord Moran, found Roosevelt was gravely ill. He was propped up, his frail body playing the role the nation needed him to play. After the conference, He couldn't even stand to give his report to Congress, and had to remain in his wheelchair. For the first time, he publicly admitted that he had previously relied on steel braces to stand. On April 12, 1945, after decades of paralysis and a crushing workload, Roosevelt's body finally gave out. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage. For that generation of Americans, he was the only president they had ever known. He was gone, but the war was not over. The entire nation was plunged into a state of profound confusion and grief. A train carrying his body traveled across the country, with hundreds of thousands of people gathering to say goodbye. Their faces were filled with sorrow, as if they had lost a family member. But just months after Roosevelt's death, 2 atomic bombs fell, and giant mushroom clouds rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war ended in the most shocking way possible. As Americans looked through old files to understand how they acquired such a weapon, they found the signature of one man on many documents, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was the one who approved the plan to develop the atomic bomb and gave it special priority above all other actions. Roosevelt's life was a microcosm of America's journey from a fiercely isolationist nation to a global superpower. He came to power during an economic crisis, using the New Deal to preserve and reform capitalism, saving the US from civil unrest. He seized the opportunity of WERI, gaining the greatest benefits at the smallest cost. He forced a bloodless abdication from Britain, positioning the US for an absolute advantage in the new Cold War era. The atomic bomb project he authorized ultimately established American military dominance. As Eleanor said, he has completed his mission. Roosevelt's life was not just the legend of a politician, but the story of a man who couldn't walk, who led a nation to a historic leap. He is gone, but he left behind a new world order and a nuclear key, capable of intimidating the entire globe.